Well, you're recording, so I'll tell you now that anything you get that is includable, you've got blanket permission.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so, I learned about you through Martin Tate, who was effusive in his praise of your role in agricultural reform in the Russian Far East. So I'm really anxious to hear how you got involved and what you did and how you saw it as it was going on. So I'll just if you will, just tell me, how did you get involved?
Let's see, long story. My first involvement was with a USAID project in 1990, late 1990.
Late 1990. Okay.
And it went on the ground in 91.
Okay. And this is a AID project for Russia.
Right.
Okay. And you had never been to Russia before.
I hadn't been to Russia before, although strangely enough, years before that, I'd talked with people in various places, and I had a curiosity about Russia, and I wanted to go. Well, then this opportunity dropped in my lap.
Okay. So you had, in the back of your mind, like many of us, this was a kind of a mystery place in a way, right?
Well, it's just I wanted to see for myself.
What were you doing at the time? What is your background? So to prepare you for this.
My background has been seed and seed technology, in general farming, agriculture, my whole life. I guess we want to call it career, started with trials and testing for various hybrid companies, and eventually into a specialized production of difficult inbreds.
Okay.
Where they would have inbreds that would make a good hybrid, but they couldn't find people who could understand the timing of the males and females and make the adjustments that it took, even sometimes chemically, such as an application of phosphoric acid will speed a female up by about 5 days. And 2,4-D will have the opposite effect. So anyway, that I was doing that. Then came an opportunity in Mexico, working with white corn, trying to backcross. It's called Rio Grande mosaic virus resistance from yellow corn into white corn, because yellow corn had it, white corn didn't. That's what I was doing when I met a guy named Andrew Watson, who was there working with the same growers that I was on vegetables. And he said, would you have any interest in doing a part of our food restructuring program in Russia? And I said, yeah, why not? So that USAID project was then how I got to Russia.
Okay.
And it was called the Food System Restructuring Program, which was an abject failure, basically.
Yeah, that's what Martin kind of hinted at, that about things, positive things coming out of failures. So
true.
Yeah. And
so, but if you don't learn from it, I mean, every scientific principle, you have to have failures to judge the successes.
Right.
You can't. Yeah. So you've got to know what went wrong to know what went right.
Well. So tell me what happened and what went wrong. What? Yeah. I mean, did you move there or did you?
Yeah, I lived there. Basically 2 months at a time.
Yeah. In Vladivostok or Khabarovsk?
In Vladivostok, actually in Ussursk.
Okay.
And the academy was now an academy. It was an institute at the time. In Ussursk is pretty much the agricultural hub of Far East Russia.
Okay.
Because they were a research institute, and the director at the time, he and I became good friends. And his deputy director was a soybean breeder. So we had breeding programs going. We actually produced what you could call an autogenous seed crop of corn and it was all sold before it was harvested.
Huh.
There was
Wow.
that much interest and demand in those things.
Uh-huh.
And there's a lot of directions I can go telling you about this, but
Well, so
during
the goal and what they were trying, why you were sent, was to bring expertise in new types of seeds and plants that they could use in
yeah,
Russia. Yeah.
well, basically they were starving,
Yeah.
and the food system restructuring program, the idea that the NGO gave to the academics in Washington was we can do this and we can create supermarkets and we can have branded vegetables and a whole pile of crap that was 50 years from ever happening.
Uh-huh.
uh, so that's how I got there.
Yeah.
The result was that the institute and the various farmers that we worked with realized that the real deal was a whole bunch different than they were being told by these NGO uppity ups.
Right.
I will call them. I mean, to inspect our progress, a congressional what do you want to call it? Junket
Yeah.
actually chartered a helicopter to fly out to these fields from
Wow.
Vladivostok, and they had no idea what they were talking about or what they were thinking about,
Yeah. Yeah.
and no realization whatsoever of the fact that nobody had the idea that you can't take people who've never worked in a capitalistic system. They have no concept of what capitalism is.
Right.
They've been told it's a bad thing their
Right.
entire life. So for any of them, there's a whole bunch of different programs about small farmers. A guy named Harry Waters, I think, was in USAID at the time.
Okay.
Jack Walters.
Okay.
Um, and he had this thing about get a whole bunch of tiny little tractors and a whole bunch of tiny little farms and create a cooperative and so on, and then get a revolving credit bank set up and so on and so forth. And I said, do you realize you're just describing the system they came from?
Yeah. Yeah.
I said 585 horsepower tractors to farm X-10,000 hectares is the worker bee theory. That's doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just does not work unless you're in a small society and there's one central point, which Shaka Zulu proved back in the 1800s.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, we went through that up through
So
95.
I'm sorry, let me ask you just, what was the name of the organization that got the grant from USAID?
Oh, TPC Giant.
TPC Giant. Okay.
And they operated under Giant Foods. TPC was a large supermarket chain at the time.
Okay. I know Giant Superstore.
Right.
It seems like I grew up in Indiana, so it seems like I remember them from Indiana, but
Well, that could be, but the Giant, they got the grant, $30 million worth.
yeah.
And the objective was our part of it was supposed to be to provide the goods, vegetables, meat, milk to this supermarket.
Right.
Well, we all told them from day one, it's a bad idea. Russian women are not going to buy more than they can carry home on the goddamn bus.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That's why you got these little magazines around where they go shopping every day.
Right.
They get what they need for a day or two because that's, 10 kilos, 5 kilos, and they got to carry it 16 blocks.
So how did you know that? I mean, you knew that because of being there and observing how people actually
observation live. And just common sense.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But
yeah.
I mean, I'm to tell you, when I see something that I don't quite understand,
Right.
I start asking why, and I start looking for reasons why they're doing it this way and not the way we do. There's got to be a reason.
Yeah. Now, what you're just describing to me, in my experience, is something not, there's a substantial number of Americans who did not do that, who arrived there and said, well, they're doing it this way because they're backwards and they don't know any better. And we're going to tell them how to do it better. And if you yell loud enough, you'll get the result you want. So
that's what I call the transplant theory.
yeah.
A whole bunch of Americans came over there believing they could transplant the American system
Right.
into Russian society. It can't be done.
Yeah.
It's not an American society.
Yeah.
Now, there are things of the American industrial complex that they could use
Mm-hmm.
and that they could learn,
Right.
because they are now forced into a capitalistic situation. And I would ask some of the newbies, I would call them, that would come over. I said, what would you do if I suddenly handed you a piece of paper that said you now own 40 acres?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Go make a living.
Go make a living. Right.
There's no credit, there's no equipment, unless you steal it from the previous cooperative or Sofcoast or collective farm, state farm, whatever.
Right.
You got no fertilizer, you got no seed,
Right.
but here you go. Here's your certificate. Go be successful.
Right. So
Bad chance.
yeah. So did you arrived before the Soviet Union dissolved, correct?
Yeah, just before it was totally done.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Okay.
And then from 92 to 95 consecutively. 91 to 91 to 95.
Okay.
And that's when we had brought our seed project to a fruition.
Yeah.
And we did that in a combination of using available technology. In other words, they had a seed farm, they had a seed drying equipment. It was pretty rudimentary,
Right.
but if you went from point A to point B, it got the job done.
Uh-huh.
Not very efficiently, but it got the job done, which was the important part.
Right.
Some of the big companies have had spectacular failures in trying to transplant American systems into Russia and or Ukraine or Romania. I've been in all of those.
Uh-huh.
And the story's the same everywhere. You just can't transplant American wishes into their society. You've got to learn what works, figure out how to make it work better with what they've got.
Right.
And then gradually, Martin will tell you, it's been 20 years since we first got together.
Yep.
And I have a picture of day one, which is me and Martin standing in a field with a rented old Kirovitz tractor, plowing up some ground that's not been farmed for 20 years. That's it. Pair of pliers in my pocket. That's all we had.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's a 30,000 hectare operation, $200, $300 million outfit. It's been bought and sold 3 times now.
Uh-huh.
But Martin still maintains some ownership in it. And the crew that I trained is still there.
Still there.
Still there.
Yeah. So wait, so I'm trying to get the sequencing. I'm sorry, because I've led you off into different tangents here. But so the AID program lasted how long?
Till December of 95, and then Newt Gingrich and the boys pulled all the foreign aid from almost all the programs, and that was one of them.
Okay. Okay.
And
yeah.
then for the next 2 years, I worked on a hybridizing of rice project in the United States.
Uh-huh. Huh.
Which was a joint venture between a Texas company and the Chinese Institute.
But you've covered all the bases.
Yeah, I've been around.
Yeah. And so the 91 to 95, and So during that period, you say you work with Martin in creating or
No, not I
modernizing?
didn't start with Martin during that period. During that
Oh,
period,
okay, okay, good, good, good. Okay, 91 to 95, and the plug gets pulled on the program, and you started by saying that program was a failure. And
the
you,
overall program was the portion of it that I was involved
right,
in. I actually tried to continue that program privately.
yeah,
And I don't know if you ever heard of a company called ICI,
vaguely familiar, yeah.
Ron Palunk Chemical Companies. So
Yeah,
ICI bought a company called Garst Seeds.
okay,
And I went to them and I said, look, there's this potential there.
yeah,
It's going to require some investment. And they actually funded a trip for me to back over to that institute with an offer that they would send one container load of seed, but the institute only had to pay the freight. But they couldn't get the funding. They had to get the funding from Moscow because they're an institute.
uh-huh,
And Moscow drugged their feet and drugged their feet. And so that died on the vine.
yeah,
And then that's when I went to the rice
okay.
project.
So
That was
what was the competitive advantage of the seed that you were developing there? Was it for a particular climate? Was it what
well,
made it competitive in a market?
basically, and this is going to sound conceited, but I created the concept of corn and soybeans for grain in Far East Russia.
Okay,
The advantage of the genetics that we could bring, I mean, not all genetics are exportable because of licenses and so on,
right.
but even those genetics that we could bring had a tremendous yield advantage and dry down so that they could be harvested without mechanical drying and used as a cash crop and or a feed forage rather than strictly silage.
Okay,
Until then, soybeans and corn both were only planted for silage.
uh-huh, okay,
And so this expanded their market opportunity tremendously. So based on those first years of grain for cash or cash grain farming, as we call it in the US,
right.
other companies made investments. A Danish company invested in a broiler operation with a Russian partner, and they now do 1 million birds a year. There are 2 or 3 egg laying operations because the feed source was now available of a decent quality.
Oh, I see. I
Prior to
see.
that, you couldn't, if you had 1 million birds, you couldn't feed them.
Oh, okay.
They don't like wheat.
Yeah. So the corn and soy, it was just what? It was ground?
It would be ground up and mixed together and some vitamins and minerals, and
And there you
there's
had
your
it.
ration, you know.
Right. Okay. Okay.
You vary the percentage of corn to soybean for the protein content that you want.
Right.
Another company then expanded, called MGK, their oil crushing facility in Useris, and started generating. They now export soybean meal,
Huh.
where
And
previously,
MGK is also uh, is a chemical company, correct?
I think they have divisions now that are ag suppliers.
Yeah.
But the MGK we're talking about is um, something combinat. I can't remember exactly what the K stands for.
Oh, okay. So it's not
But
it's not a Sumitomo.
it's
Uh,
not a no.
okay. Okay.
Although I don't know currently, I haven't been back there for a couple of years.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know currently. Sumitomo may have acquired them just as because they were very interested in them, and Mitsui and Mitsubishi
Right.
are all interested in producing um, the rapeseed oil for etching of metal in manufacturing.
Wow.
They
Okay.
wanted to do 100,000 hectares of that and crush it. So they may have formed some sort of joint venture. Who knows?
Okay.
At this point, I can't tell you. At the time, the last time that I knew, one of the primary owners of MGK was the governor of Primorsky Krai,
Okay. I think we're talking about two different companies that have the same name.
probably.
Yeah.
Same acronym anyway.
Same acronym. Yeah. So going then, what your project, your part of this food system reform was to create this source of feed, and through your seed hybridization, right? If I'm using the right words, right?
Yeah,
And
essentially.
that part was successful in creating the conditions for a broader expansion of agriculture.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which
Okay.
has now expanded to over 800,000 hectares of commercial agriculture, corn and soybeans.
Wow. Wow. So this combination of corn and soybeans, it was that it wasn't grown previously, or that it was an improved varieties that you brought to it. What was the innovation there?
The innovation was growing it for cash grain rather than as a forage.
Okay. And with what the varieties of seed they had, they couldn't have done that previously.
No, the institutes, most of the breeding for their, call it in-house varieties, came from Czechoslovakia. And when the Union split,
Yeah.
that breeding was cut off. They were left with what they had, which is an institute in Krasnodar.
Yeah.
And they were heavily of a genetics called Flint.
Uh-huh.
And Flint is considered the type of corn you need to grow in northern latitudes
Uh-huh.
because it can withstand cold temperatures for germination, so on and so forth. However, Flint takes years to dry down.
Huh.
So if you harvest it in the fall, you either have to artificially dry it, and because of its nature, the kernel's structure, it takes a tremendous amount of energy to dry it.
Uh-huh.
And what you've got left is still flint corn, which has got a higher percentage of the pericarp, or higher percentage of insoluble fiber versus
Uh-huh.
the starch level, which is where the feed comes from.
Uh-huh. Huh.
So we have in the US, we have yellow dent and we have what's called an iodent. The iodent variety can be bred into very early maturing varieties, but has a characteristic of drying down naturally in the field.
Uh-huh.
So the first one of the side story, first several years that I was involved with Martin, he said, we can't grow corn because we can't dry it. I said, get the right genetics, you don't have to. What do you mean? I said, we can grow corn without a dryer. If we got a place to put a little aeration on it, we're good to go. He says, well, what would that be? And I says, I know exactly which hybrid that should be. So for the next 4 or 5 years, we grew corn, and everybody in the region, this is one of the things that really turned it on. All the farmers in the region would drive by on the roads watching us harvest and watching the trucks go straight to the elevator for sale at Moisture.
Yeah.
And so on. So we had a lot of those caravans. When we actually were on TV when we brought the first flex head John Deere combine over to Combine Beans.
Wow.
Yeah, been on TV several times for that. Yeah.
So, but that was later. That was
after 2004, right?
Okay. Yeah. So, but the seed project that you were working on initially, You know, I'm sorry I keep going back to it, but
No, that's all right.
who owned that? I mean, who was
Well,
there?
the
What the seed? Who actually owned the rights to that?
I shared the rights with the institute.
Okay,
We had a contract for the use of these genetics, and I
right,
had a license from the people in the United States.
right.
And the funding was supposed to come from TPC Giant. Well, when that left, it left us with a contract wherein we had 50% of nothing,
Uh-huh.
essentially.
Yeah.
We had done some crossbreeding of Russian and American varieties, trying to improve their varieties because they had more of that available to use in production than importing. Pretty expensive to import parent stock from the U.S.
Right.
Um, so that contract still exists. It's still in the drawer and the desk of the director. And in fact, now I've got a new one where we're going to cooperate on a parent seed production enterprise,
Huh.
and third parties will take those parent seeds and produce the actual F1 seed.
Okay.
And Martin is one of those who will produce F1 seed.
Okay. Okay. So once your program was over, you had produced a seed or a hybrid, but then there was no capacity then to use it, to put it into general use at that point.
Well, everything we produced the first on the first full year
Right.
was sold before it was harvested.
Yeah.
Where the fallback, or where the downfall came, or the drought, if you want to call it that, was the lack of funding
Yeah.
instigated by Gingrich and his boys
Right.
to bring new parent seed. We were at the point now, we were right at that point of expand it and blow it up,
Yeah.
and we couldn't do it. There was no funding to follow through. The Institute didn't have any funding to speak of.
And Giant wouldn't fund
And
it.
Giant got booted with the rest of the programs with the congressional deal. They just got the tap turned off, in the story.
Yeah.
And they had a ton of money invested in a store, two stores actually.
Yeah.
They had built, but they couldn't put goods in them. They couldn't put anything in them. They had acres and acres of shelves. All they had was the same stuff that the Russian magazines had.
Right.
99% of that from Japan or China.
Uh-huh. Huh. Huh. So they had figured that they were going to do like McDonald's did, was to build out their whole supply
Yeah, we're
chain.
going to roll this out across Russia. We're going to roll this out across Russia.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there were their supermarkets did develop much later, but
They have, but they've also developed in what had since developed suburban areas.
yeah.
Now the supermarkets are in the suburban areas. They're not in the downtown.
Not in the down. Well,
The old Goom stores, some of those have been repurposed.
right.
But in general, all the supermarkets I've seen are in what we would call a shopping center.
Yeah. 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 I'm thinking of the ones, ones where near my friends in Moscow, I used to walk to this.
Moscow's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
You can't put Moscow in terms of any analysis with Russia.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Right. That's
a city state.
Yeah.
City state.
Yeah. So you were, during that first period, you were coming back and forth. Were you living there?
Right.
Yeah.
So I was spending like 6 months a year.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot. And then you were cut off, and you tried to keep it going, but that didn't work. And so how did you get back involved in it then?
Martin.
Yeah. How did you know Martin? Where'd you meet Martin?
I think Martin and I actually met in 90 something at a place called the Vlad Motor Inn,
Uh-huh.
Vladivostok. I don't know if you've ever been there or not.
I've been to Vladivostok, but in 1990, before any of this
Oh,
happened,
that was a
just really,
Canadian venture.
yeah.
Guy actually built this hotel on barges and floated it to the beach and drug it up on the beach and parked it on a foundation. It was a guy from Canada.
Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, it wasn't cheap,
Yeah.
but he had North American stuff. If you wanted steak, he had it, and all of the NGO people, because they have these huge per diems
Right.
and expats, loved staying there.
Uh-huh.
So he made good money with that. It's still going. It's still Canadian owned.
Still Canadian owned and still operating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. And there was a pretty big NGO expat community, relatively large, right?
Yeah, at that time there was Peace Corps was there. A dozen other efforts. Some were related to accounting.
Yeah.
One of the guys I met was trying to convert Russian businesses from their debit-oriented, I guess, accounting system to the U.S. style or the Western
Right.
style. And he was pulling his hair out, and I said, "Just give it up, man.
Yeah.
Look at the bottom of the page. If they got the right number or not."
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but Jesus, I can't read. Well, that's your problem, not theirs. They can't read yours either.
Right. Right. Right.
Oh, we had another group that was there on this part of the TPC giant thing on the vegetables, and they were going out to little farms around where they would see a patch of vegetables. And they were trying to sell them on the idea of putting a sticker on their vegetables when they go to the market, so they have a branded vegetable.
Yeah.
Well, 90% of those vegetables weren't going anywhere but right in the kitchen.
Right.
And the other 10% they would sell at the local bazaar without paying anything for stickers.
Right. 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 Right.
But
they weren't interested in commercial truck gardening.
It's a case of opportunity first, storage.
Yeah.
So you produce a whole bunch of cucumbers, let's say. Where are you going to store them while you sell them off? You're not going to sell them all off in one day unless you're going to sell them for nothing.
Right.
Potatoes wintertime is when you want to sell potatoes.
Right.
But you got to have proper storage. Their old system of burying them in the ground with straw.
Right.
Sure, it sort of works. It'll keep you alive until the next crop, but they're not very nice,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
They just could not relate between subsistence level gardening, farming to capitalistic gardening, farming. And there's still a big gap there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I at one point in time talked to a couple of guys about who wanted to come in and do an IQF freezer factory. And I said, "What are you going to freeze?" "Well, sweet corn, green beans. Where are you going to get it?" "You going to grow it?" "Well, no." "Well, then you might as well stay home and save your money."
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just not happening. Realizing those things as you go along by trying to put yourself in the other guy's shoes,
right,
is, I guess, one of the biggest advantages you can have if you can actually do that.
Right. Right.
Rather than take it from the top down and think you're going to enforce top down ideas, management, even culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know that I got really ingrained in the culture to know it well enough, but I did become friends with a lot of people, and they have friendly relations, still back and forth with me.
Right.
Um, and you just know certain things that they do within their culture that seem a little odd to us, but it's how it is. You have to have the funeral the next day because preservation is not common. It does exist, but it's not common.
Not common. Yeah. Right.
And once the funeral is over, it's over.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the king is dead, long live the king.
Yeah.
And until you really understand what that means, a lot of these other things are going to seem odd.
Yeah.
Marriage, some success stories that came out of it.
Yeah.
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who worked for us or with us during those years who are now captains of their own businesses.
Uh-huh.
And the one gal worked as a translator, and she was observing all the things we were talking about.
Right.
She said, "So how the hell do I start a business?" Well, that's amen. Question number one.
Right.
And we said, put together a letter of what your abilities are and your idea, your business plan idea, what you think can work. Said, and you send that to as many companies as you can get. See what you get for replies. Well, her idea was the little coolers with ice cream in front of the magazine.
Okay.
She started that.
Really?
Really. Mars Company answered her letter, flew her to California, and had a meeting. And they said, well, so how would this work?
Yeah.
Well, you got to furnish these little coolers, but for every piece of your goods that gets sold out of that cooler, you get the normal profit, plus you get a license fee, a royalty of 2 cents or something, because Russians love ice cream.
Right.
And they love all kinds of ice cream.
Yeah.
So they said, well, here's what we'll do. We'll give you 10 machines and we'll give you a container of product. If you can come back and buy another container from what you get out of that, we're on.
Yeah.
She is now the president of Mars, Russia.
Oh my goodness. Whoa.
Yes.
Whoa.
Another young fella who worked he studies as an agronomist, but while we were there, we could pay so much more than anything else. He worked as a driver for us, but over the days, going here and there, you get to know people. And he had kind of the same question. I said, one of the things in the future that's going to be a big deal is ag supply, seed, chemical, machinery.
Yep.
He now owns the largest ag chemical supplier and Kloss dealership in Far East Russia.
Wow. Wow.
So those are kids that have taken our training.
Right.
And guidance.
Yep.
Another young guy that was a driver now owns and operates an appliance store with all the electronics, so on. And he's well known throughout Far East Russia.
Right. Right.
So there's
and they were all people. These were all people who came and worked for you in this
for the
initial
NGO
grant period.
Yeah, but
yeah.
Were my personal acquaintances.
Right. 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 And so you said there were 5 of them? Were there a couple?
Yeah, there's another guy became the director of that million bird facility.
Okay. Okay.
His name was Oleg Mamayev, and now he works for Mark, the Avon girl, Mary Kay. Estee Lauder. She's now one of the top people in Estee Lauder in Moscow.
Okay.
Moscow is, like I said, it's a city state.
Right. Right.
Those women spend money on
Yeah.
paint and filler to do laid to rail.
Right. Yeah. 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 And so these folks, some of them learned the agricultural business, and some of them just learned business. You know,
business in general. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
things that were personally, the cosmetics thing is a woman who had big interest in cosmetics.
Right.
And rather than pay somebody a whole bunch of money, somebody pay me,
Yeah. Right. Right.
The girl with the Mars candy bars and stuff, or ice cream, she just wanted to start a business. And she took some of her basic knowledge of Russians. This is where the Russian culture, she knew that ice cream in any form was going to sell.
Right.
And if it had an American, for some years there, if it had an American label, it was going to sell twice as fast.
Right.
Just like the blue jeans and the.
Yeah. Do you know what year, around approximately when did she start that business?
Would have been, she was in the process when things closed down, when Giant closed down.
Right.
But it would have been in 97, 96, 97. She kept it.
Yeah.
Kept it going. One of the guys from the NGO that I worked with on various other projects privately around the world lived in California, and he kept in touch with her a little more than I did. During that phase.
Right.
But
that was pretty forward looking for Mars as well. I mean, I know Mars was heavily involved in Russia, probably before that. So they probably could understand where she was coming from a bit, whereas other companies, not so much.
I think they were so big. We got this girl who, if it works, it's a home run.
Right.
If it doesn't work, so what? It's the gnat on her ass.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think it's like ICI taking a shot to send a container of seed over and so on.
Right, right.
It's a so what to them.
Yeah, yeah.
They're big enough. It's like buying a lottery ticket.
Yeah.
Cost them $1, cost them $1, and if it scratches off good, we're home run.
Right, right. Well, on the other hand, there were a number of companies, even they were huge, who would have required prepayment as proof that the person was serious, were much more reluctant to take any kind of risk.
Right.
You know, and so I mean, I know that from personal experience and from listening to other people that that's really a lot of that period was like, Russia, you got to be kidding me. Prove it, Yeah.
Yeah, and they're sitting on the outside looking in now.
Right, right.
Which, okay, good for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of the things that have been done aren't necessarily good for Russia.
What do you mean?
Well, John Deere's got some joint ventures with China and with Russia.
Yeah.
And all that accomplished was concentrating wealth in the hands of the people least likely to distribute it.
Okay. You mean their partners in Russia became
the oligarchs, the oligarchs,
little oligarchs. Yeah.
It's just exploded there in the last 5-7 years.
Yeah.
And you can't fight. I mean, you can fight it, but you're not going to win.
Yeah.
Especially with Putin as president. I mean,
right.
If you look back, you see that Yeltsin and Gorbachev had the most realistic view of where Russia fit in the world. Until along came Putin and his cronies.
Right.
And they've turned it into a slave state again. At least
so before you started back in there. So you had this gap of years, and then you started back with Martin. Let's go back to this. You met Martin at the Lad Motor motor hotel
That would have been in 90 something when he was first starting coming over there.
with the dairy board, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah,
fiddle diddling around.
yeah,
He's kind of a quirky guy.
uh-huh, yeah,
But we chatted, and
yeah,
so on. Well, then when he decided he thought about going farming,
right,
the way we got together was he called the U.S. State Department and through the embassy in Vladivostok and asked him, I know you had some people over here before. Who would you recommend that I get in touch with about an agricultural project?
uh-huh,
And they said, well, duh, here you go.
yeah,
And so just a blind contact. And I was in Romania actually at the time,
uh-huh, uh-huh,
and had a time frame that I could come across. So I went from Romania to Vladivostok and knew people. I mean, got to meet up with friends again and things like that.
right,
And then went roundabout with Martin, looking at various places that he wanted to. Thought about buying the entire collective farm or whatever.
right,
Which that didn't necessarily turn out that way, but he had a good team of people that just kept buying up the pie.
yeah,
And then eventually you had enough pie, you could say, I'll exercise my rights on on this piece of ground.
right,
And it would match up, 200 hectares, 400 hectares. Managed to put together 7,000 contiguous hectares.
wow,
And it's just expanded from there. But that
yeah.
farm was nice. That is nice.
And around what years was that?
That was 04 through 10, that first 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. And so what happened to your soy and corn varieties after you left? Were people using that type of plant, or did that
The soy varieties that I brought over, Martin will tell you they're still being planted.
Yeah,
The chain of ownership and rights and so on has long been negated by the, backdoor stuff,
right.
which Martin's guilty of himself. But
Yeah, yeah. And so because you said the Danish poultry farm depended upon the existence of this feedstock,
right,
and so it must have exploded, and some after you
did.
left, the use of this exploded, right?
Yeah, the genetics that we used because of licensing and difficulties, we ended up using Pioneer genetics
Okay.
on the corn, but I knew the genetics and I got them the variety that they needed to be able to grow corn without artificial drying
Right.
and still get a decent yield.
Right.
We used that particular cross for like 4 or 5 years, and then Pioneers. I have a good friend and a colleague that I worked with for many years in Pioneer research, so I had a little bit of an inroad there.
Uh-huh.
And we would start selecting their newer varieties that had similar characteristics but different yield parameters and so on.
Uh-huh.
Up until now, I mean, basically we made Pioneer the #1 seed in that region. And Martin tried to have a dealership for a while. He's done a whole bunch of different things.
Right.
Some to degree of success and some not so much. But
Yeah. Yeah.
he's kind of a shotgun approach
Right.
kind of guy.
Yeah. Yeah. But the Russian farmers who adopted this, they were buying the seed from Pioneer then?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Through the local
you
ag
broke the
supply
market.
stores, like our friend, our young guy.
Yeah.
He handles a lot of seed. He's got Syngenta, and he's got, all of the big companies discovered that, goddamn, there's a market here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
But
now that
you broke
includes
that
VA.
open for them, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
created it for them.
You created it, and
Didn't get a dollar out of it.
right. And then the Russian farmers were growing this soy and corn stock, and that allowed for the Danish chicken farmers
And dairies.
and
There's two
dairies.
big dairies in there now.
Yeah, and those came in when, in the late 90s? When did
No, in mid 2000s,
mid
2005,
2000s? Okay,
7, 8, 9.
yeah. So
They've just really matured now as they shook the bugs out and they've got them working now as pretty substantial operations.
so it's taken 15 years at least for the Russian Far East to begin to solve some of its food problems.
Right. And
Yeah.
what's happening now is the same thing that's happened in the United States. Now the small farmer, if you want to call them that, there were quite a number of guys who were acquiring US type equipment, at least European but
Right.
larger equipment, farming a larger number of hectares that they either rented or bought 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 hectares. Now comes companies like Armada, which is a Chinese joint venture with a Russian partner.
Yeah.
They come in and they'll take 10,000 hectares in the patch, 20,000.
Wow.
Another one's called Ross Agro. That is directly involved with Moscow.
Right.
The funding comes from the state budget, and they just wipe the floor clean of anybody that gets in the way. They'll take 100,000 hectares.
Wow.
Well, then Putin threw them a bone of there's the Federal Reserve land, which is all the old state farms,
Right.
that are not being farmed.
Right.
So rather than recreate state farms, he said, well, here's the deal. If you take the land and cultivate it for 2 years, it's yours. Which was a bone thrown directly at companies like Ross Agro, because they had the funding to acquire all the additional equipment, everything it took to take on these expanded acres.
Right.
And the private guys had less of that ability.
Right. Right.
But even the broiler company got involved in pretty large scale agriculture.
Which company?
The chicken company.
Oh, really?
Chicken broilers. Yeah, they're looking at, all right, we're buying corn by the ton, by the ton, by the ton, by the ton.
Right.
Why don't we grow it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they looked at it as a vertical integration.
Right. Right.
And they do some, but they didn't really have the success that they thought they were going
to have. Yeah. What does that mean? They didn't have that.
They were under educated or under knowledge base when they started it, and they relied on Russian agronomy, Russian agronomists,
right,
and managers, whereas they needed to at least work in a blend, which is what Martin has done, is a blend of, which is what I've told everybody that would listen.
Yeah.
You can't replace their system. You got to figure out what works.
Right.
Between the two systems, you got to allow some of what they do to stay.
Yeah.
Because it's the only way it works.
Right.
You may not like it, but it's the only way it works.
Yeah.
And you've got to put your attention, your finance, your effort where you can improve the total system. You end up with a blended, what we in one business plan we call the Russian American model. And that's, so the broiler company they were a little bit iconoclastic in their thinking, yeah, shit, we can do this without any outside influence. And I doubt they couldn't very well do that.
They couldn't properly farm that land.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
because
All right.
some of the academic agronomy, I would stand up for almost any Russian agronomist. They're very academically well educated,
Right.
and they're generally smart people.
Yeah.
It's when they get stubborn and afraid to take on some new ideas or some
Uh-huh.
ideas that are counter to what they were taught
Right.
that things start to go south.
So do you think that they get stubborn because it's a kind of national pride? It's like, I don't like to be told what to do, or you're acting superior to me, or stuff. Why do you think that happens?
I All of that plus personal ego.
Uh-huh.
Um, the hardest thing to do is admit you need help,
Right.
no matter who you are or what you're involved in.
Yep.
And the even harder thing is to accept it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, there's some guys I've run across. It's just personal ego because they don't know about these various things. They don't,
Right.
or they've always done it this way.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know that, but we can try another way and see if
Yeah.
you think that,
Yeah. Yeah.
don't have to change everything. Let's just change something and then see how it works.
Right. But the kind of success stories that you talk about must have had some impact on them and their thinking.
It does. Yeah,
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's particularly the Russian Far East. In Central Russia, I deal with some people in Central Russia too,
Uh-huh.
around Krasnodar and Voronezh,
Uh-huh.
Voronezh,
Verona, yeah.
and the Far East being more culturally diverse to start with because of their proximity to China and Japan.
Uh-huh.
They have learned from the others more than Central Russia is just an island.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And if it ain't Russian, it ain't shit. Don't exist.
Right. Right.
Um, whereas the Far East has had various, all through history. I know a guy that was over there in 1978
Uh-huh.
on a potato project. So throughout their entire history, the Far East has not always been Russia.
Right.
So there's a multitude mix of cultures there
Yeah.
that have made the people a little more acceptable and a little more free thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plus the fact that they're not Russians. Multiple numbers of them are diaspora Ukrainians.
Huh.
Russia transplanted in the late 1860s. They transplanted a whole bunch of people to the Far East to bring it under cultivation and so on. And so their bloodlines,
Yeah.
and they're all mixed up now, but
Right.
their bloodlines actually go back to Ukraine more than they do to Mother Russia.
Do they hold on to that culturally?
Yeah, they can still speak Ukrainian, some of them.
Yeah. Huh.
I jokes with them. Instead of saying "do svidaniya," I'll say "do побачення."
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. I never thought about the Ukraine. So their sense of themselves is a little different than.
Yeah, they've got a little more of, I don't know what, I wouldn't say it's entrepreneurial spirit, but a little more self-sufficiency spirit.
Okay.
They-
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't like the government as much as Central Russia
Uh-huh. Right.
pretends to like the government.
Right. 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 So, this is off so there's a couple other questions I want to ask you in a different direction, but while we're talking about this in Krasnodar, Russia is what now the largest wheat exporter in the world.
Right.
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 And so something has gone right with Russian agricultural reform in the breadbasket, because that's not coming out of the Far East. That's coming from the breadbasket of Russia in the Black Earth areas. So
The golden
what went,
circle.
huh?
They call it the golden circle.
Yeah. So what went right there? I mean, or is that something that you followed?
Well, I have, because I'm actually currently providing some seed stock to a Russian company near Krasnodar.
Okay. Okay.
There have been improvements in wheat genetics in general.
Uh-huh.
So the Russians aren't immune to that. The balance of that is the fact that they're the world's largest exporter does not mean they are the world's largest producer. It only means that they need cash.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you look at their other crops, they're one of the world's largest importers of sunflower.
Uh-huh. For the oil.
For the oil, for
Yeah.
fats and protein, animal protein.
Okay.
So it's a Peter to Paul thing.
Yeah.
They never take one figure out of a Russian report and figure it's true. There's
Okay.
always a but. If this is true, then this should also be true, and it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So they should not be importing any feedstuffs. If they were world's largest exporter, that means they have an excess crop, and they don't. It's like China exporting canned goods. In the early days of trade between Russia and China, after the wall came down, and the U.S.,
Right.
the Chinese people were getting hungry, but they were exporting canned goods because they could sell them for cash.
Yeah. I see.
And same thing with the Russian vodka in the very beginning.
Right.
That was the commodity. That was the currency.
Right.
We'll give you a shipload of vodka. You give us a shipload of wheat,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Right. Right.
So,
right. You must know that the old story about Pepsi and Stolichnaya vodka. Do you know that?
no, that one I don't.
So when Pepsi went into Russia in the 70s, they negotiated the deal where they swapped Pepsi syrup for Stolichnaya vodka, and so their cash out for Pepsi was the sale of the Stolichnaya vodka, and so in America, Russian vodka was always Stolichnaya because or Stoli, as everybody says,
right?
Because the Pepsi marketed it, and there was no other Russian vodka available, and it was Pepsi's. It was the determinant of how much syrup Pepsi would ship into the Soviet Union. The more vodka they could sell, the more syrup they could ship in, and the more they could occupy the monopoly of that soft drink. So,
right.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, footnote to history, I guess, or whatever, of how that worked. So,
well, those are the personalized knowledge and experiences that let you be well aware when you listen to somebody talk bullshit.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so it's interesting then, the agricultural reforms, there are reforms, there have been changes. There is, as you said, a cash crop of wheat, but then there are imports to make up for the fact that they haven't fully reformed agriculture enough to be
Well, their trade
self-sufficient.
balance, they've got a trade balance problem, same as we do.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Their economists are never going to report that.
Right. No, that's not the way the statistics are ever presented. So back to when you went there, did you have the idea that you were going to change them, that you were sort of bringing a superior methodology or science there, and going to either help them or change them? And how would you characterize what you were thinking?
I tried not to have preconceptions.
Yeah.
My goal when I went there was to experience some of Russia,
Yeah.
and B, to see if my ability to select genetics and crop production techniques would work.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So that was the number one.
Right.
The other things became extensions of that.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Okay.
my curiosity, I guess, I think on your questionnaire was, well, curiosity would be right up there along with a little bit of ego about being able to provide proper genetics for a first shot out of the box.
Right.
In
Right.
fact, one of the here's another conceited statement, but one of the guys from TPC Giant, noting the success of our first year of test plots, said, "What you did is the equivalent of shooting a bottle rocket to the moon."
That's a good one. That's a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah.
I might put that quote in the book. I like, to kind of pepper a few quotes in there. That sounds like a good one. So let me ask you this: how do you think Russia changed you, or did it?
Well, yeah, it did. I mean, you can't be even partially immersed in another culture without some thought of expansion of thought, recognition of humanity in general,
Uh-huh.
um, and understanding that friendship and common caring for each other is not a cultural thing.
Uh-huh.
It's an interpersonal thing. And it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, or what you do.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a true friend to somebody, you're a true friend. And that's why I've got people there who I consider as much as family.
Yeah. Well, do you think there's something particular about Russians and their notion of friendship versus an American notions of friendship?
Um, yeah. And Americans talk about friendship with somebody they know and they can call. Russians look at friendship more like I don't know what, like a godfather relationship, or
Yeah.
a baptismal sponsor type relationship, although it's nothing to do with religion.
Yeah.
Um, it's if you're a friend to somebody, if you call them, they help you, no questions.
Yeah.
If your friend calls you, you help them, no questions. And that's a piece of culture that the United States does not have, and
Yeah.
probably never will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know exactly what makes that in Russia so much stronger than it is around in the United States. But the United States, somebody calling you a friend is like, so what?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
You're a friend as long as they remember your name or whatever.
All right. Right.
After that, so what? Even the other cultural difference, though, that really sticks out is the alcoholic problem in marriages.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And we have it, but we look at it from a different perspective. But it is really a big problem in some areas.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you encounter that? I mean, my sense is that when I started there in the early 90s, huge problem,
It
highly
was then.
prevalent.
It's gotten better.
And then by the 2000s, business people in particular, were like, they didn't have time for that. They had too many other things going on to spend time getting drunk and then recovering from it and clouding their judgment. They couldn't be bothered with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's another interesting note, is that when we first started in Russia, a 2 o'clock meeting was anywhere from 2 to 7. They would show
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
Now, believe it or not, if they call for a 2 o'clock meeting and you're 15 minutes late, you catch hell.
Yeah.
They learned that business etiquette
Yeah.
from us in that respect. Most of the people who now are engaged in these larger scale ag operations that have come from, I will say, our foothold or our training, our roots
Right.
in Far East Russia, have adopted our policy, which was, I don't care what happened. If you show up drunk, you're gone.
Yeah.
I don't care if you're the boss. I don't give a shit who you are.
Right.
You show up to work drunk, you're gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we treated them, we paid them well. Martin always argued with me. I said, you got to give this guy a raise.
Yeah.
And you need to move this guy from here to managing that. I was pretty good at picking those people out.
Uh-huh.
And he would argue sometimes. And I said, well, guess what? I know somebody that will pay him.
Well, were you what in that 2004 going forward? Were you actually partners with Martin in his agricultural thing,
No,
or
I
you
was
were
a
advisor
consultant.
to him?
I was a consultant to him.
Okay. Okay.
We behaved like partners, though, in some respects. And I told him from day one, my first statement to Martin when we're driving around looking at this land is, he wanted to start the following spring. And I said, if you got $1 million up your sleeve that you don't need, that won't affect your kids' groceries or college tuition or anything like that. And I mean, what do you mean? I said, you have got to have $1 million that's totally can get burnt up and turned to ash before you even think about going into this project. If you don't have it,
Yeah.
then don't do it, because you can't save yourself.
Uh-huh. Huh. And did he go get it?
Yeah. He
Yeah.
gulped and he said, well, okay. Yeah.
But that was the kind of advice he needed. Honestly.
Yeah. The other piece, the same day, the other piece of advice I gave him was, I said, people who acquire land anywhere in the world, who acquire land in 20 years are multimillionaires.
Okay.
And that's happening.
So are there things that I haven't asked you about that you wanted to talk about in this discussion?
No, we pretty well babbled it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
There's a lot. We could talk for weeks.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it probably just boils down to different examples of the same thing.
Uh-huh. Okay. Okay.
Um,
Okay.
Well, I think number one was, I think you wanted a sense of cultural inclusion or exclusion.
Yes, I did. But I also wanted those examples of the real results of the interaction.
Yeah.
Um,
You won't find anybody in Primorsky Krai that doesn't think there's been a positive result from the root start of what the NGO did
right.
get done.
Right.
Even though I would say that was very limited effect directly from the NGO, but the effect happened afterward from the people who were involved in the NGO.
Right. Right.
So it did have a catalyst effect.